Hi there, folks. So, what I want to discuss is really my beliefs about history and how the church became paganized and how it became corrupted with a kind of paganism over the years. So, really, a long checkered history with Jewish belief. It goes back so many thousands of years, back to the mystery of origins, really. Mysterious in the sense that there's a lot of different competing theories about where in the world it originated from. Well, we think probably the area is probably within Arabia or Northeast Africa. It's known as the Horn of Africa, because all the countries that are there, all the different language families, all related linguistically. Hebrew, Arabic, Somali and Ethiopian, they all have the same root language. So I think probably it was likely to be that area. It may well have been somewhere else. They may have migrated to that area from Africa or somewhere, perhaps. And if you look back, there's so many different ancient accounts of the Jewish faith having different kinds of faith, where it changed over so long. It's very hard. It's impossible to give a sort of full account of it because it's such a long, complex history, really. I mean, the short version is that there were times when they were very faithful to God, and there were people that were very devout. There were very moral laws, and also times when they were very absent from God, and times when they weren't. So it's very it varied huge amount, and we know up to the time of captivity in Babylonia, where at that point the tribes had been scattered and they were all in different places, of course. And I think it was the Persians then, wasn't it, who defeated the Babylonians, and they inherited the empire until the Greeks, I think, were next, and then came the Romans, of course. So very much there was a diaspora of different Jewish tribes living throughout that whole region, of course. And with the age of the Persian Empire, they were then much more freer to travel than they did, and they were then in different areas, and including Jerusalem, of course, where they re-established their temple, the second temple as it became known, I think, after the original temple, that's Solomon's temple. But that goes back to an earlier, ancient, much more ancient history. And of course we come on to, after the Greeks Empire, the Romans, of course, then inherited that area. It's a sort of like a long procession almost of different empires that controlled, and as they did, so also their own theistic influences permeated, and those had an influence and effect on the various Jewish tribes, of course, scattered throughout the different regions. There were some that were more under the influence of the Roman Empire at that time, but then there were others also that lived perhaps further south in African regions or in other places in Asia, for example, too. So there were a whole variety, but of course Jerusalem at that point, several thousand years ago, became much more the focus, the centre of Jewish study, where they had their libraries. There would have been scribes studying things then, of course. And, at that point, of course, there would have been a whole school of Mosaic believers, people that were binded by belief in the Ten Commandments, of course. And really, actually, the commandments, really, they're just another version, another way of sort of saying God's law. Just that there are it's always the same law, but there's always just different ways of translating that. So Moses is known as the lawgiver, but actually it's always the same law. It wasn't really through Moses an introduction of a new law, but it was a reinforcing of older laws already existing, but given in a new, more legalistic framework. So often it's providing a new medium to translate, to be held accountable to, but not a new message. It's still an old message, but in a new kind of format, very much. And that's what it is, really, because each time, through these other influences, people of monotheistic belief become more influenced by other sort of pagan idols, very much like we have today. These things have always been there. The idea of worshipping other things rather than God, putting other things, or people, in fact, at the centre of our lives. Of course, people can do a lot of good and a lot of bad. We're all capable of that. But no man is all good, of course. We're all capable of having some corruptions. We all do have some. My life experiences teach me that. I don't need a book to tell me that. But what I do with books is to see whether they reinforce something that is moral or not. I don't assume that any book has got an infallible guide to it at all. I don't see any medium, whether it's a book, a film, whatever type of media it might be. I don't assume anything is infallible or beyond questioning, therefore. Everything has to be looked upon and discerned and compared to moral law. And you need to consider, and that's through a process of discerning, questioning it. And something that's true can withstand good questioning, so it's right to sort of fairly question anything or anyone. And my belief, I suppose, that all of us have got some corruptions about us, necessarily therefore also implies that the things that we create also have got a degree of corruption about them too, as an extension. So if mankind is fallen, is corrupted in his nature, and I don't believe that because a book tells me, I believe that because of my life experiences that have taught me that over the years. That even very nice people that are well-meaning, that work hard, devote their time and energy and money perhaps to helping others in many good causes, but even so can still have some issues, some problems, some faults. I haven't ever witnessed or experienced anyone to be perfect all of the time in all situations. And I think if you are under a lot more stress and in a difficult situation, especially for a prolonged period of time, then you're much more challenged and more likely, therefore, to commit a sin that I would describe as intentionally harming others. And that's, again, I draw on that as being my life experience. When your life's going well and you've got lots of support and you're not under so much stress and things are okay, it's much more easier to be supportive to others, to be happier and joyful. It's much more of a challenge, isn't it? When the situation's harder, when there's less of a support, when there's more of a stress. And it's in that kind of scenario that we're all much more prone and likely to harm others, even if it's just small things. Sometimes, it could be just snapping at someone or saying a bad word or not making as much of an effort as we could perhaps, And so I think when you look at high standards of expectation, yes, it does cast us all as sinners, but it's necessary to have those standards to hold each other accountable to. If we don't have those, then what do we have? Another way of simplifying the Ten Commandments, I suppose you could say, is, I wouldn't say you can easily simplify them. In fact, I think that they are perhaps overly simplistic anyway. I don't really like reducing each one to a single sentence. I think each sentence, each commandment itself merits a whole book, a whole library, in fact, of discussion, and it's much more complex, each issue, than you'd first realise. It's much more, some issues are much more debatable. For example, what is murder? It needs to be defined clearly. We need to understand the context of when is taking an innocent life wrong? When is killing someone right, under what are those circumstances? And that's something that very much involves discussing and debating with ourselves, but with others too, and engaging in the process, and that's something that really, to justify the complexity of a subject, really merits having a lengthy discussion. One sentence doesn't really do justice to actually the complexity of it. So if I look back to that time, I think it's quite possible. If you think about it, that there would have been thousands of scribes and scholars and preachers and people that believed in the commandments. They may have discussed its intricate meanings and debated it, but they believed that it had some essence. Quite what that was, they may have had different sectarian disputes, but there was something that they had a belief about one God, although they may have had varying ideas about God. They had belief that murder was wrong, although they had varying debates about what constituted as murder. The same for stealing or adultery, for example. But there were core Mosaic beliefs, despite the sectarian differences. And that would have upset other people, of course, especially the Roman authorities, you can imagine at the time, preachers, scribes, giving out this kind of information that's perhaps critical of Roman practices. You can give an example. Think of the Roman wars. Think of the various empires' wars of conquest. Where they were trying to keep various national disputes in line. Maybe to prevent the sovereignty of areas where people may have wanted some degree of independence, like in Egypt, for example, or Judea, or in other regions, perhaps North Africa, for example. So it may have been that they didn't like, and they certainly wouldn't have wanted to have that kind of discussion. They would have wanted to control it themselves, and they would want to say, no, we're going to decide based on our own laws, which will be derived from what benefits our own interests, of course. That will be the deciding factor of what's right and wrong in our... So, that would be the governing influence of that time. They would want control over discerning. Their legal system would be dictated by their own desires, by by protecting their own interests, essentially. And so a varying legal and moral framework that other people believed in, and believed in it to be superior to the Roman legalistic system, would have been a challenge, and something that they would have considered, something that they didn't want, they wouldn't like it, and had to be suppressed, either to control it or to influence it in some way, sabotage it somehow, so that you're able to, or if you couldn't influence and control it enough, to destroy it. And indeed, eventually there's a siege, or there's some sort of battle, and we don't quite know how it happened, the Jewish Roman war, but eventually the Second Temple itself then is destroyed, of course. And so, that's the context, and there's good reason why they would want to suppress that. It's driven not just by nationalistic interests. The Romans want to sort of keep their own empire intact, not just the Judeans. If they got independence, the Egyptians, the North Africans could have a domino effect. So they very much want to suppress the nationalistic endeavours of some, but also the theistic too. The Romans had their own pantheon of different gods, of course. They had pagan beliefs, the whole variety of different pagan idols that they'd inherited from the Greek Empire before it. But of course, there were many Greeks also that were monotheistic, actually, and there were probably some Romans perhaps that were too. It's very much like with Hindus, actually. There could be some that are more monotheistic and believe that there are just different ideas, but about the same one God, the same absolute reality, however you describe it. Or, there could well be that they believe that there are different gods. And now, there's obviously that conflict, but we don't know the exact nature of that. History is written by the victors, of course. That's what Winston Churchill famously wrote. And there's some truth in that, of course. How can we be sure accurately of history based on the fact that we all tend to write things from our own biased perspectives, of course. One would not expect the Romans to write about the Jews in a particularly good light, of course. And, that would be almost absurd to even think that they would write an accurate record of people that they were engaged in a conflict with. There's an old saying that the first victim of any war is the truth, of course. Propaganda is always, and psychological control of information is always a vital component of any war. So why shouldn't it have been with that one? It would be. And so very much you can imagine the Romans would portray the Jewish diaspora, the group, in a bad light. They might portray their version of God as being a judgmental, an angry one who has a dislike of humanity and wants to sort of rule them like a tyrant, perhaps. Whereas the Jews might say that this was a righteous God who frowns upon corrupt behaviour, and it's merely a desire to discipline others, that we're held accountable to moral law. Very much, if you look at the New Testament, actually, this portrays the Sanhedrin, who of course would have been the Jewish authorities, the Jewish legal authorities. It really portrays them in a very bad light. The whole document reads almost in an anti-Semitic fashion, really. It's almost could have been written by someone who had a real dislike of Jews from that time. And that seems very much to me like a good motive of why the Romans would have portrayed and written those documents, really. What I would say is that there probably was some truth within those documents. But I think over the years, what my suspicion is that what happened is that they then, because the Jewish faith with its belief in the Mosaic commandments wasn't destroyed with the temple, its travellers using the Roman roads were now scattered and has set up small communes all over the empire, in North Africa and Europe. So its diaspora was still scattered all over the place. Destroying the library wouldn't have destroyed all their records. Certainly there would have been archives of various other Old Testament records and various other scribes' writings, scattered throughout the whole region. So it would be kind of impossible to track down and find them all and destroy all of them. So at that point, they of course still had their own pagan beliefs, and that's what they lived by. Some people worshipped different ideas about God, or they worshipped money, or they had these varying different kinds of belief in God or demons or different spirits of different types. But what you then have is this diaspora of Jewish people that have these belief in Mosaic commandments and in a monotheistic God. And they haven't been extinguished with the temple. They still remain. So they're like, I look at it as like scattered seeds. And it takes them decades to grow up and so for their libraries to begin growing again. And the Romans, of course, have to go around, imagine a whole lawn, and they're going around weeding, taking out bit by bit. But it's a long process. It's the more they're destroying all these other beliefs that may somehow be a threat to their own, more are spreading quicker than they're able to remove them. So it's a sort of long process like that, really. And so that carries on going, and they're not able to remove them all, therefore, because they're scattered so far and so wide, and they grow at such a pace faster than they're able to remove them all. So it becomes impossible as a challenge to eradicate all of them completely all of the time in every place. So what it then becomes necessary for them to do, and what I think they then decide to do, is to marry some of the beliefs of the Jewish beliefs with their own pagan beliefs. And so that's where Constantine comes in, of course. And he then changes their Shabbat, the Sabbath, the day of their worship, to Sunday, of course. And the day when they worship Solar Invictus, who was their sun god, of course. Not all of them, but a very prominent pagan idol of the Romans was the Solar Invictus, the sun god that they worshipped. I think they had a moon cult and a sun cult and various other cults too. So they had... Well, actually, if you look at the words, the evidence is left within the wording of the days of the week, in fact, that are inherited from those Roman times, interestingly. So you'll see, like the Sunday, the various days of the week named after the different planets. So very much they were into astrology. They inherited that too from the Greeks as well. And so they very much ascribed each of the planets, the Romans, in as having an emotional resonance, as having something that is a theological belief for them. That each of the planets are associated with a different emotion and a different kind of belief, really. That this Saturday is named after Saturn, of course. But each day of the week, if you trace back its linguistic origins, is named after a different planet. And their day of worship was on the Sunday because they considered the sun to be the most important for them. And you can see the reason why, it provides all that light, doesn't it? And that, well, of course, the Jews didn't. They didn't worship creation, not the sun, the moon, the stars, not the earth itself, and not a person either. They wouldn't have worshipped a prophet. They wouldn't have worshipped a messenger. They wouldn't have worshipped any person at all. It would have been completely alien, that kind of belief, and not something that ever had any history. Something that would have been and still is considered blasphemous and idolatry and against the Mosaic commandments, in fact. And so that must have been something that then later was added to marry that pagan belief that they had with the Jewish ancient belief. So I very much think that that's at some point what happened. If you look back far enough, there were all these different books in circulation, but no one can quite date accurately exactly when they happened. But at some point, Constantine, he summons together all these different scribes from across the empire, and they gather together all the different records. And it's during that time that he then gives the seal of the emperor, who then decides this is the officially sanctioned book. And that then becomes the Bible. That didn't actually exist until that point. At that point, there were just thousands of different books, of course, many of whom were dating from different periods of history. There were just lots of different libraries, but it was only around Constantine's era that those books are gathered together that are now known as the Bible. And he gives it that authorized approval. And so that then becomes the official book. Whereas before then, there were libraries full of hundreds, perhaps thousands of different accounts. And so that to me then is sort of building up. And that's very much the Catholic Church then inherit that position, where they then become the official religion of the empire at that time. And it's really to appease both the growing diaspora of Hebrew believers, but also the pagans. So it's sort of trying to appease the monotheistics by also having an element of theirs, but it remains sort of very paganized, where the prophets turn now into a son of God. It's become very much idolized. It's become, paganized very much. Where all these kind of so that's very much how I view. And if you look at the Catholic Church, actually, interestingly, it has got vast collections of all these statues. Interestingly, the original commandments, of course, the Hebrews said, not to make a graven image of anything in heaven or in hell, not to make these kind of statues of people. That was something against the original beliefs of the early church and of the Jewish faith, in fact. So that sort of gives you the evidence therein that the Catholic Church at that point are, of course, they're doing things that were anti-Hebrew, that weren't part of the original faith. They've got all these different statues and pictures and, of different people, and that's very much, because, and the reason why that was disallowed, because it very much leads to worshipping different groups of people, that idolatry. It very much distorts our way of thinking and looking at the world. If I put up a statue of a white man all over the world, am I celebrating white people or men as well? If I put up statue, of one particular race or gender or age or profession, or if I just put up lots of statues of one person, we can see the evidence of that going on in the world. There was a time in China a while back when it was the law that every house had to have a picture of Chairman Mao within it. That's the kind of idolatry it can lead to, the hero worshipping of someone. And we know the dangers of that because, when someone is idolized to that extent, that they really then are being beyond any questioning, and no one can fairly criticize their behavior and their policies. It creates then an era where someone is unaccountable and beyond reproach. And like I said to begin with, we all have the possibility to do good and bad, of course. And so that idea of deifying someone in that fashion, not just someone in politics or religion, but anyone, if we hero worship someone in our lives, if we get infatuated with someone, yes, we may love a partner or a parent, a child. It's lovely to see the good in someone, but to not recognise whatever faults they have too, to follow someone uncritically, that's to sort of, to allow them to get away with whatever bad. And actually someone that really cares about you, as hard as it is, will want to see the good and the bad, because if you don't recognise the faults you have, how can you actually address those issues? So I personally do take issue. I don't think that there ever was this person that was a son of God or that was perfect or infallible. I never have believed in that because my life experiences teach me otherwise. I've never met a single person that's always good, that doesn't make any mistakes, that's not selfish sometimes. I think we all can be sometimes. And I'm not saying that we're all doing it to the same extent. You can do a small amount or a large amount. It can vary hugely, of course. Right? But as I do say, and my life experience, if it teaches me anything, is that everyone's quite capable, of making some mistakes or doing things wrong on purpose, in actual fact. And we all do. I witnessed it, I've experienced it. I don't need to believe that, I know that, And you need to be taught by your life experiences, right? Not by other people's or their stories. It's good to learn what other people say. Of course it is. It's good to listen. We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, because I think that's right, that we need to absorb and listen to a whole variety of different sources of what lots of different people are saying. We need to consider all different people's opinions. We need to value their assessments, not necessarily being conformed by them, though. We need to look at what virtue there could be in others, whether they're pagans or monotheistic or whatever persuasion they are, and consider, the validity of what they might be saying, and consider, what background they might be from, I don't say, therefore, that there is no validity or nothing great and inspirational about those books in the Bible. I don't then claim that there's nothing at all. I say, therefore, that because of that idolatry within that there is at least some information I find is false within that does not accord with me and my life experiences. And I have to say what I believe is true, bear not false witness. That's one of my beliefs. The truth is that important. And, I can't be persuaded otherwise, because it would be to deny my own life experiences and all the evidence, therefore, that I've seen. It would be to have learned nothing and to have kind of walked through life blindfoldedly. I don't claim to know if the crucifixion happened or not, or what relevance it might have. But I do say, and I can't think otherwise, that there isn't anyone who has a divine connection to God any more than we're all capable of. As an atheist for many years, I believed that no one had a connection to God. I thought it was all delusional and just the imaginations of wishful thinkers, or people that were overactive thinkers, perhaps. I spent many years investigating since then as an agnostic atheist, as an agnostic theist. I think my conclusions over the years of studying is really that everyone is capable of having some kind of relationship with God, and that no one is really capable of being any closer to God than any other, except for their own ability, their own effort, their own desire and determination to have that. So that's sort of my belief, I suppose. I sort of felt it was kind of important to state what my beliefs are and why they are that as well, I suppose. And, other people, I respect people have different beliefs in life, of course. I kind of think the idea that we were children of God, I think was a good and useful metaphor, not a literal thing though. I'd like to say today, actually, I find it more useful to think of us as being students of God and God as our teacher, in fact. I find that much more useful metaphor personally. But I can see the merit in thinking of God as a parent. I wouldn't myself say God the Father because I find that's a little bit sexist. Not that I'm nervous of groups of feminists, but I find that God either created both genders, but that God somehow is transcendental and beyond that kind of form and doesn't really have a sex exactly. And that God, therefore, I would describe in a gender neutral term, like God the Guardian or something, that could be seen as either gender or neither, perhaps. I see that as much more of a sort of a much more apt, a better description, I suppose, really. I don't say that there's no merit in some of the Roman ideas about God. There may have actually been some good and some bad within it. That's my suspicion, actually, I think. And I do think that about some pagan beliefs, actually. I wouldn't sort of necessarily say they're all the same thing, because that's sort of dangerous to sort of lump too many things undefined as the same. So that basically, sort of rambling on, concludes sort of my general thoughts about that whole sort of situation. I just felt it was necessary to try and give a concise account of what my actual feelings are regarding the whole situation, I guess.